My sister called my son a bastard at every family event. I made sure she never opened her mouth again. My sister Holly always had to be the perfect one in our family with her investment banker husband and her 2 kids who played violin and spoke 3 languages. I never cared about her showing off until I had my son Oliver. See, Oliver's dad bailed when I was 6 months pregnant. But I didn't care because I had a good job as a physical therapist and could handle being a single mom. My parents were amazing, helping with babysitting and being completely obsessed with their first grandkid. For the first year, everything was actually peaceful. Holly lived 3 hours away, so we only saw her at major holidays. And even then, she mostly ignored Oliver to talk about her kids' achievements. I figured she was just jealous that her kids weren't the only grandchildren anymore. Then Oliver started walking and talking. And suddenly Holly had opinions. It started at Easter dinner when Oliver was 18 months old. He was toddling around being cute, and my dad was helping him hunt for eggs when Holly said it was a shame Oliver would grow up without a father figure, since boys without dads always ended up troubled. I told her that was ridiculous and plenty of single moms raise amazing kids. She just shrugged and said statistics don't lie while looking at Oliver like he was already doomed. By his 2nd birthday, Holly had escalated to calling Oliver that poor child whenever she talked about him. She'd tell her kids to be extra nice to their cousin because he didn't have a daddy like they did. When Oliver started preschool, she asked if I was putting him in therapy yet for his abandonment issues. He was 3 and happy as could be, but according to Holly, he was already damaged goods. The word bastard started slipping out when she thought I wasn't listening. She'd whisper to her husband about how embarrassing it was to have a bastard nephew. At Thanksgiving, she actually told her kids not to get too attached to Oliver, because children from broken homes often had behavioral problems. Oliver was right there coloring and looked up confused. That's when I started getting really angry, but my mom kept saying Holly didn't mean anything by it and I shouldn't start drama. The breaking point came at our family reunion last summer. Holly had been drinking wine all afternoon and got louder with each glass. Oliver was playing with his cousins when he accidentally knocked over Holly's daughter's lemonade. Holly grabbed Oliver's arm and yanked him up, saying, "This is what happens when bastards don't have fathers to teach them manners." Oliver started crying and asked me what a bastard was. In front of 40 relatives, my sister had just taught my 5-year-old son that word while calling him one. Everyone went silent, but nobody said anything to Holly. That's when I decided my sister needed to learn exactly how it felt to be humiliated in front of family. First, I did some digging on social media and found out something interesting about Holly's perfect husband. He'd been commenting a lot on his young assistant's posts, especially the bikini ones from her vacation. The comments were just friendly enough to not be proof of anything, but suspicious enough to plant seeds of doubt. I screenshot everything for later. Then I found out through our cousin that Holly's investment firm had just lost a huge client because of a mistake she'd made that cost them millions. She'd been hiding it from everyone, pretending work was going great. At Christmas, I put my plan into action. Holly started her usual routine, making passive-aggressive comments about Oliver needing a male role model. I let her go on for a bit, then mentioned how nice it was that her husband was mentoring young women at his company, especially that pretty assistant he seemed so close with. Holly's face went white. Her husband started stammering about work relationships. I kept going, saying I'd seen how supportive he was on all her beach photos, and it was refreshing to see a married man so comfortable with young female friendships. Holly tried to change the subject, but I turned to her kids and said they were lucky to have parents who trusted each other so much. The tension was incredible. Then my aunt asked Holly about work, and I jumped in saying Holly was being so modest about her recent big moves at the firm. Holly tried to shut me down, but I kept praising her for handling that major client loss with such grace. I asked if she'd found new clients to cover the millions in lost revenue yet. Her husband's head snapped toward her, demanding to know what client loss. Holly had to admit in front of everyone that she'd been hiding a career-destroying mistake for 3 months. The perfect family image shattered in minutes. But I wasn't done. I turned to Holly's kids and said they should be proud their mom was handling everything so well at work. Her oldest daughter looked confused and asked what I meant about clients. Holly's face went from white to red as she tried to shut down the conversation, but my uncle jumped in asking if everything was okay with her job. I kept my voice sweet as sugar while I explained that Holly had been so brave dealing with losing that major account. And wasn't it amazing how she kept showing up to family events pretending nothing was wrong? Her husband grabbed her arm and pulled her into the kitchen, and through the doorway I could hear him demanding to know why this was the first he was hearing about any of this. Holly tried to say it wasn't a big deal, but he was getting louder, asking how losing millions of dollars in revenue wasn't something she'd mentioned to her own husband. My mom looked at me with this horrified expression, but I just smiled and took another bite of my Christmas cookies. Holly came back to the table with mascara running down her face and announced they were leaving. She grabbed her kids' coats and started shoving their arms into sleeves while they protested about not getting dessert yet. Before she walked out, she looked straight at me and said, "I would regret this." I told her I'd been regretting staying quiet for 5 years while she tortured my son, so we were even now. The door slammed so hard it rattled the windows, and the whole family just sat there in silence staring at their plates. The next morning, my phone started blowing up before I even got out of bed. Text after text rolled in from aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who'd heard about what happened at Christmas dinner. My Aunt Sarah sent 3 paragraphs about how families should support each other through hard times, not air dirty laundry in public. My cousin Jake said Holly had it coming after years of being cruel to Oliver, and he was glad someone finally called her out. Uncle Mark wrote that I was out of line bringing up work issues that weren't my business to share. My phone kept buzzing with new messages every few minutes, and I realized the family had split into two camps. Half of them thought I'd crossed a line by humiliating Holly in front of everyone, especially about her marriage and career. The other half admitted they'd watched Holly be nasty to Oliver for years, and were relieved someone finally stood up to her. I sat in bed scrolling through the messages, and it hit me that I'd just blown up our entire family dynamic in one dinner. My mom called around 10 in the morning, and I could hear she'd been crying before she even said hello. She begged me to call Holly and apologize, saying the family couldn't handle this kind of drama and someone needed to be the bigger person. I asked her why I should apologize when Holly had spent 5 years calling my son a bastard and nobody ever asked her to say sorry. Mom said that was different because Holly never meant to hurt anyone. She just had strong opinions about family structure. I actually laughed at that and told my mom that calling a 5-year-old a bastard to his face wasn't having opinions. It was being cruel. Mom started crying harder and said I was tearing the family apart, and couldn't I just smooth things over for everyone's sake? I told her I was done smoothing things over while my son got treated like garbage, and if the family couldn't handle me defending Oliver, then maybe they needed to pick better battles. She hung up on me, which she'd never done in my entire life. Around noon, my phone lit up with a text from Holly that was so long it came through in 3 separate messages. She wrote that I was a jealous single mother who couldn't stand seeing her happy and successful, so I decided to destroy her marriage out of pure spite. She said Bryson's assistant was just a work friend, and I'd twisted innocent social media comments into something ugly because I was bitter about being alone. Holly claimed I'd always been jealous of her perfect family, and used Oliver as an excuse to attack her when really I just hated that she had everything I wanted. She wrote that bringing up the work situation was a low blow because she'd been handling it privately, and I had no right to embarrass her in front of the whole family. The texts kept coming, saying I was a terrible sister who prioritized revenge over family unity, and that Oliver would grow up learning it was okay to hurt people who made you angry. She ended by saying she hoped I was happy now that I'd ruined Christmas and turned everyone against each other. I screenshot every single message she sent because the way she was defending herself so hard told me I'd hit way closer to the truth than she wanted to admit. If Bryson's assistant really was just a work friend, Holly wouldn't be this defensive about me mentioning it. If the work situation was actually under control, she wouldn't be this upset about me bringing it up. I saved all the screenshots to a folder on my phone labeled Holly's Meltdown and didn't respond to any of her texts. Let her sit there wondering if I was going to share her messages with the family too. That afternoon, my dad called and I braced myself for another lecture about family harmony and being the bigger person. Instead, he said he was proud of me for finally standing up to Holly's bullying. I almost dropped my phone because my dad never took sides in family conflicts, always playing the peacekeeper role. He told me that he and my mom had heard Holly make cruel comments about Oliver for years, but they didn't know how to address it without causing drama. Dad said they'd convinced themselves Holly didn't really mean anything by it, and that confronting her would just make things worse. But watching her grab Oliver's arm at the reunion and call him a bastard while he cried made my dad realize their silence had enabled her behavior. He admitted he should have shut Holly down the first time she made a comment about Oliver not having a father, but he'd taken the easy route of pretending it wasn't a big deal. Dad said he'd talked to my mom last night after she got off the phone with me and told her they needed to stop protecting Holly from consequences just because she was their daughter too. He knew my mom was upset about the family fighting, but he wasn't going to ask me to apologize for defending my son when Holly had never apologized for years of cruelty. I started crying on the phone because having my dad's support meant everything, and I'd been so sure the whole family would turn against me. He said Oliver was lucky to have a mom who would fight for him, and Holly needed to learn that treating people badly eventually catches up with you. We talked for almost an hour about how the family had always swept problems under the rug instead of dealing with them, and maybe this blow-up was necessary even if it was painful. 2 weeks later, Oliver climbed into my lap while I was reading on the couch and asked why Aunt Holly was mean to him. My stomach dropped because I'd been hoping he wouldn't bring it up, but I should have known better. He asked if it was because his daddy left, since that's what Aunt Holly always talked about. I felt my heart break into pieces as I tried to figure out how to explain adult cruelty to a 5-year-old. I told him that sometimes when people are unhappy with themselves, they say hurtful things to other people, and it has nothing to do with the person they're being mean to. I said Aunt Holly had some problems in her own life that made her feel bad, so she tried to make other people feel bad too. But none of it was his fault. Oliver seemed to accept that answer and asked if Aunt Holly was going to be nice now. I said I wasn't sure, but I promised him that I would always protect him from people who were mean, even if they were family. He gave me a hug and went back to playing with his trucks, and I thought that was the end of it. But over the next few days, I noticed Oliver being quieter whenever anyone mentioned family gatherings or asked about his cousins. He stopped talking about wanting to play with Holly's kids, and when my mom called to say hi, he didn't want to chat like he usually did. I realized the Christmas confrontation had affected him more than I thought, and now he was being cautious around anything family-related. Part of me felt vindicated that I'd stood up to Holly, but another part felt sick that Oliver was picking up on all the tension and changing his behavior because of it. The first week of January, I ran into our cousin at the grocery store, and she pulled me aside in the produce section to tell me that Bryson had moved out of Holly's house right after New Year's. She'd heard it from Holly's neighbor who saw him loading boxes into his car on January 2nd. Apparently, Holly had confronted Bryson about the social media comments with his assistant the day after Christmas, and he'd admitted to having what he called an emotional affair. He swore nothing physical had happened yet, but he'd been texting the assistant constantly and had taken her to lunch multiple times without telling Holly. Holly had demanded he cut off all contact with the assistant, but Bryson said he had genuine feelings for her and needed space to figure things out. So he moved into a hotel and then got an apartment near his office. Our cousin said Holly was a complete mess, crying to anyone who would listen about how her marriage was falling apart. Part of me felt vindicated because my comments about Bryson's assistant had hit a real nerve and I hadn't been making something out of nothing like Holly claimed. But another part of me recognized that I'd just blown up my sister's marriage in front of our entire family at Christmas dinner. Sure, the problems were already there, but I'd forced them into the open in the most public and humiliating way possible. I stood in the grocery store holding a bag of apples and wondered if I'd gone too far. But then I remembered Oliver crying at the reunion asking what a bastard was, and the guilt faded pretty quickly. On Monday morning at work, my coworker Michelle stopped by my treatment room between patients and mentioned she'd seen a job posting online for an investment analyst position that sounded exactly like Holly's job. She thought it was weird since Holly had just been bragging at Thanksgiving about a promotion she was expecting. I pulled up LinkedIn on my phone during lunch and found the posting Michelle was talking about. It was definitely Holly's exact position at her firm, which meant they were replacing her. I started digging deeper through LinkedIn and company news and discovered Holly hadn't just lost a client like I'd mentioned at Christmas. She'd actually been forced to resign. The mistake she'd made involved giving bad advice that cost the client not just money, but also created potential legal liability for the firm. Holly's bosses had given her the choice to resign quietly or be fired publicly, so she'd taken the resignation option to save face. Nobody in the family knew the full extent of how bad it was, including Bryson apparently. I had screenshots of the company's internal communications that our cousin had forwarded me months ago, proving Holly's mistake was way worse than anyone realized. I sat at my desk staring at the proof on my phone, and part of me was tempted to share it with family members who thought I'd exaggerated about Holly's career problems. I could completely destroy what was left of her professional reputation by showing everyone the truth. But something stopped me from hitting send on those messages, and I just saved the screenshots to the same folder as Holly's defensive texts. On Tuesday afternoon, someone knocked on my apartment door, and when I opened it, Bryson was standing there looking furious. He demanded to know why I decided to destroy his family at Christmas dinner. I told him to come inside because I didn't want my neighbors hearing this conversation. Bryson stormed into my living room and started yelling about how I'd made his private relationship with his assistant into a public scandal. He admitted the situation with his assistant was inappropriate, but said he and Holly were working through it privately, until I decided to announce it at Christmas dinner. Now Holly was telling everyone he was a cheater. His kids were asking why Daddy didn't live at home anymore, and his parents were calling him a disappointment. I let him finish his rant, then asked him how long he'd been planning to leave Holly for his assistant. He stammered that it wasn't like that. They were just friends who got too close. I told him that friends don't comment on each other's bikini photos with heart emojis and offers to go to the beach together. Bryson's face went red and he said I had no right to go through his social media and twist everything to fit my narrative. I said I wouldn't have looked at his social media at all if Holly hadn't spent 5 years calling my son a bastard. Maybe instead of yelling at me, he should ask his wife why she was so cruel to a child. Bryson said Holly's comments about Oliver were just her being honest about the challenges of single parenthood, and I was too sensitive. I told him to get out of my apartment before I called the police, and that if he ever defended Holly calling my son a bastard again, I'd make sure everyone knew exactly how many times he'd taken his assistant to lunch on company time. Thursday morning, my boss asked me to come to her office before my first patient arrived. She closed the door and told me that 3 clients had requested different therapists over the past week because they'd heard about my family drama through the small-town gossip network. She wasn't firing me, but she needed me to understand that my personal life was affecting my professional reputation. One client had specifically mentioned hearing about me publicly humiliating my sister at Christmas and decided she didn't want therapy from someone who handled conflict that way. My boss said I needed to keep future family issues private because the clinic couldn't afford to lose clients over staff personal problems. I sat there feeling my face burn with embarrassment and anger. I was facing professional consequences for defending my son from someone who'd bullied him for years. My boss kept talking about maintaining professional boundaries and community reputation, but all I could think about was how unfair it was that I was the one getting punished. Holly had spent 5 years being cruel to a child and nobody cared. But I exposed her secrets once and suddenly I was the problem. I left my boss's office and went straight to the bathroom to cry before my first patient showed up. I realized revenge had costs I hadn't fully considered, and protecting Oliver was going to affect more than just my relationship with Holly. That afternoon, Oliver's preschool teacher Harper called my cell phone during my lunch break. She said Oliver had been acting out in class over the past week, pushing other kids during playtime and saying mean things he'd never said before. Yesterday, he'd told another student that his mommy said some people deserve to feel bad, and today he'd pushed a girl off the swing and called her stupid. Harper said this was completely out of character for Oliver, who was usually one of the sweetest kids in class. She gently suggested that the family tension I'd mentioned at pickup last week might be affecting his behavior more than I realized. Harper recommended I consider getting Oliver some counseling to help him process whatever he was picking up at home. She said kids absorb adult conflict even when we think we're protecting them from it, and Oliver clearly needed help working through his feelings. I hung up the phone and felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Protecting Oliver was my whole reason for confronting Holly at Christmas, and now he was the one suffering from the fallout. He was acting out at the school, pushing kids, saying cruel things, and it was because of the family war I'd started. I'd thought standing up to Holly would show Oliver that I'd always defend him, but instead I'd created an environment where he was learning that hurting people were acceptable when you were angry. Friday night, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw that Holly's daughter Zoe had posted something cryptic about fake friends and people showing their true colors. I clicked on her profile and saw she'd been posting sad quotes all week about betrayal and loneliness. Then I noticed Blakely's account had a post from Holly saying they were looking for a new violin teacher because their previous one had decided not to continue lessons. I messaged our cousin and asked what was going on with Holly's kids. She told me that other parents at their private school had heard about the Christmas drama through the gossip network, and some of them had started excluding Holly's daughters from playdates and birthday parties. Apparently, the school had a very tight-knit parent community, and word had spread that Holly's husband left her for his assistant, and she'd lost her job. Some parents didn't want their kids associating with children from that kind of family situation. Blakely's violin teacher had dropped her as a student, because the teacher was friends with one of the moms who decided to distance herself from Holly's family. I felt genuinely sick reading about what was happening to two innocent kids who had nothing to do with their mother's cruelty, or my public revenge. Zoe and Blakely were paying the price for adult conflicts they hadn't caused, and I'd never wanted to hurt them when I exposed Holly's secrets at Christmas. Saturday morning, my mom called while I was making breakfast for Oliver. She asked if we could all come to Sunday dinner because she wanted to talk about something important. I knew from her tone that this wasn't going to be a normal family meal. She said both Holly and I needed to be there to work things out as a family. I told her I wasn't interested in making peace when Holly still hadn't apologized to Oliver for calling him a bastard. My mom got quiet for a second, then said she couldn't handle the divided family anymore, and the stress was affecting Dad's blood pressure. She said if Holly and I couldn't figure out how to be civil, then she was done hosting family events. It felt like an ultimatum, and I was furious that they were pressuring me to reconcile when Holly was the one who started this whole mess. But I agreed to come because I didn't want Oliver losing his grandparents over adult drama. I told my mom we'd be there at 6 and hung up feeling like I was walking into an ambush. Tuesday afternoon, I stopped at the coffee shop near my clinic to grab something between patients. I was waiting for my order when I heard two women at the table behind me talking. One of them mentioned Holly's name and I froze. The woman said Holly had been seeing a therapist for severe anxiety and depression. She told her friend that Holly had a complete breakdown at book club last week, talking about losing everything she'd built. The woman said Holly cried for 20 minutes about her marriage falling apart and her career being destroyed. I stood there holding my coffee, feeling something I didn't expect. For years, I'd seen Holly as the perfect sister who had everything together, and used that perfection to make me feel small. But listening to this stranger describe Holly's breakdown made me realize she was probably miserable the whole time. Maybe she took out her unhappiness on easy targets like me and Oliver, because she couldn't admit her own life was falling apart. I left the coffee shop feeling confused about whether my revenge had been worth it. Thursday morning, the cousin called while I was doing laundry. She said she needed to tell me something about Holly's situation. Holly's forced resignation meant she lost unvested stock options worth over $200,000. Combined with Bryson leaving, Holly might have to sell their house because she couldn't afford the mortgage on her own. The cousin said several relatives were lending Holly money to help her stay afloat, which was straining their own finances during a tough economy. My aunt had given Holly $5,000, and my uncle had covered 2 months of the girls' private school tuition. I realized my Christmas revelation had created a domino effect that was hurting people who had nothing to do with the original conflict. Family members were draining their savings to help Holly survive the fallout from secrets I'd exposed. I hung up the phone and sat on the floor surrounded by clean clothes, wondering how protecting Oliver had turned into financial crisis for half the family. Friday afternoon, I picked Oliver up from preschool and he was quiet on the drive home. I asked if something happened at the school, and he said a kid told him something during recess. Oliver asked me if I made Holly's family fall apart because she was mean to him. My stomach dropped and I pulled into a parking lot so I could turn around and look at him. He said the kid at the school told him that I ruined everything at Christmas, and now his cousins were sad. Oliver's eyes were filling with tears, and he asked if it was his fault that Holly's family was broken. I unbuckled my seatbelt and climbed into the back seat to hug him. I told him that none of this was his fault, and that adults sometimes make mistakes when they're trying to protect people they love. He asked if I made a mistake and I didn't know how to answer. I said protecting him was right, but maybe I did it in a way that hurt more people than necessary. Oliver was taking on guilt for adult conflicts that he didn't understand, and I had no idea how to explain that the world was more complicated than good people and bad people. Saturday night, I checked my email before bed and saw a message from Holly. The subject line said, "We need to talk." I almost deleted it, but something made me open it. Holly wrote that she wanted to apologize to Oliver but needed to set some boundaries about family information staying private. She admitted she was cruel about my single motherhood because she was projecting her own marriage insecurity onto me. She said watching me seem happy as a single mom while she was miserable in her perfect marriage made her jealous and mean. But then Holly wrote that I had no right to publicly destroy her life in front of 40 relatives at Christmas. She said I could have confronted her privately about her behavior toward Oliver, instead of exposing her marriage problems and career failure to the entire family. The email was raw and honest in a way Holly had never been with me. She wasn't making excuses for calling Oliver a bastard, but she also wasn't pretending that what I did was justified. I read the email 3 times trying to figure out if this vulnerability was real, or if Holly was manipulating me into feeling guilty. The next week, Michelle pulled me aside at work during our lunch break. She said she was worried about me because I'd become obsessed with tracking Holly's situation. Michelle pointed out that I spent every break scrolling through social media looking for updates about Holly, and seemed angrier now than right after Christmas. She asked if I was okay, and I snapped that I was fine. Michelle said I clearly wasn't fine, and that my anger was starting to affect how I treated patients. She mentioned that I'd been short with a client that morning who asked about rescheduling. I told Michelle to mind her own business and walked away. Later that day, my dad called, but I let it go to voicemail. He'd been calling less frequently over the past few weeks, and I knew he was caught between supporting me and helping Holly through her crisis. I listened to his message and he sounded tired. He said he loved me but couldn't keep choosing sides in this family war. I realized I'd isolated myself by making everyone pick between Holly and me. My support system was falling apart under the weight of prolonged family warfare. Wednesday night, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw Bryson had updated his relationship status. He was now listed as in a relationship with someone named Jessica Smith. I clicked on her profile and recognized her from the bikini photos I'd found last fall. She was the assistant whose posts Bryson had been commenting on. I scrolled through their photos together and saw they'd been publicly dating for at least a month. Holly's worst fears had come true, and Bryson had left her for the woman she suspected. I sat there staring at photos of Bryson and the assistant at restaurants and events. Holly was now a single mother facing the exact situation she'd spent 5 years mocking me for. But she was also dealing with career destruction and financial crisis on top of the divorce. I had a choice to make about whether to keep enjoying her downfall or recognize that she'd hit bottom. Continuing to push served no purpose except cruelty, and I was tired of being cruel. Thursday morning, I woke up and made a decision. I opened my laptop and found the folder where I'd saved screenshots of Holly's forced resignation details. I'd been considering sharing them with family members who thought I'd exaggerated her career problems. The screenshots showed emails between Holly and HR discussing the exact nature of her mistake and the firm's decision to force her out. I stared at the files for a long time, then selected them all and hit delete. I realized Oliver didn't need me to completely destroy his aunt to feel protected. At some point, revenge crosses from justice into something uglier, and I'd already crossed that line. I was exhausted from months of anger, and ready to see if there was a way forward that didn't require total family destruction. I emptied the trash folder on my computer and felt something shift inside me. Friday afternoon, I called Holly's cell phone. She answered on the 3rd ring, and we were both silent for a few seconds. I told her I'd read her email and was willing to meet somewhere neutral without our parents. Holly suggested a park halfway between our houses. We agreed to meet Sunday at 2 in the afternoon. When I got there, Holly was already sitting at a picnic table looking smaller than I remembered. I sat down across from her and we stared at each other. Holly started talking first and apologized for years of cruel comments about Oliver. She admitted she was jealous that I seemed happy as a single mom while she was miserable in her perfect marriage. She said calling Oliver a bastard was unforgivable, and she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again. I told her that publicly destroying her life at Christmas went further than necessary. I said I could have confronted her privately about her behavior instead of exposing her secrets in front of everyone. We both started crying and agreed we'd hurt each other enough. The next Tuesday, Holly texted asking if she could come to my apartment to apologize to Oliver directly. I asked Oliver if he wanted to talk to Holly, and he nodded. Holly arrived at 6 with a stuffed dinosaur for Oliver. She sat down on the floor with him and told him she'd said mean things because she was sad inside. She said none of it was his fault, and that she was sorry for making him feel bad. Oliver looked at her for a minute, then asked if she was still sad. Holly said she was working on feeling better. Oliver hugged her and asked if his cousins could come play sometime. The simplicity of his response made both Holly and me realize how much we'd complicated something that could have been resolved much earlier. Oliver ran off to play with his new dinosaur, and Holly and I sat on my couch in silence. We both knew we'd never be close sisters, but maybe we could be civil for the kids' sake. The following week, Holly texted asking if she could take Oliver to the park with her girls. I said yes because Oliver had been asking about his cousins non-stop since her apology. I watched from a bench as Holly pushed all 3 kids on the swings and helped them build a sandcastle together. She was patient and kind with Oliver in a way I'd never seen before. And when he fell and scraped his knee, she cleaned it up and gave him a hug without any of her usual judgment about single moms raising fragile kids. On the drive home, Oliver told me he liked having his aunt back and asked if we could do it again soon. I told him we'd try to see them more often, but that sometimes grown-ups needed time to work through their problems. He seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to playing with his dinosaur. Over the next few weeks, Holly and I started texting about normal things like what the kids were doing in the school and funny stories about their latest antics. We weren't close, but we were civil, and that felt like enough given everything that had happened. She sent me a job posting for a position at a smaller investment firm and told me she'd applied even though the pay was less than half what she used to make. I could tell she was scared about starting over but trying to stay positive for her girls. My mom called to say she was relieved Holly and I were talking again because the family tension had been making her physically sick with worry. I told her we were working on it, but that she needed to stop expecting us to go back to how things were before, because that version of our relationship was built on Holly's cruelty and everyone's silence about it. 3 months passed, and I got a call from Harper asking if I had a few minutes to talk about Oliver. My stomach dropped because I immediately assumed the worst, but she quickly reassured me that everything was fine. She said Oliver had been doing much better in class over the past several weeks and seemed back to his normal, happy self. He was playing well with other kids again, and his aggressive behavior had completely stopped once the family drama calmed down. She told me he seemed more secure and confident, which was exactly what I needed to hear after months of worrying I'd damaged him permanently with the Christmas confrontation. I thanked her for calling and hung up feeling like I could finally breathe properly for the first time since the holidays. That afternoon, I picked Oliver up from preschool, and he ran to me with a painting he'd made of our family. He'd drawn me, his grandparents, Holly, and his cousins all holding hands under a big sun. I asked him why everyone was holding hands, and he said because families stick together even when they fight sometimes. The simple wisdom of a 5-year-old hit me harder than any therapy session could have. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Oliver was more careful around family gatherings, though, asking me questions about why adults get mad at each other and whether everyone would be nice at the next dinner. He developed a cautious awareness that hadn't been there before, checking my face for signs of tension whenever Holly was in the room. I hated that he'd lost some of his innocent trust in family harmony, but I also knew he was learning that relationships could survive conflict and repair themselves with effort. 4th of July came around and my parents hosted a barbecue in their backyard. I arrived early to help set up and found Holly already there arranging plates and cups on the picnic tables. We said hello and worked side by side in careful politeness, both of us aware that the whole family was watching to see how we'd interact. My dad fired up the grill and Mom kept nervously glancing between Holly and me like she expected us to start fighting at any moment. When other relatives arrived, there was an awkward tension as people tried to figure out whether they were allowed to mention Christmas or if we were all supposed to pretend it never happened. My uncle made an uncomfortable joke about keeping the peace this year, and everyone laughed too loud. Holly's girls ran straight to Oliver and they disappeared into the yard to play on the swing set, completely unbothered by the adult weirdness surrounding them. I watched Holly watching her daughters and saw her shoulders relax a little when she realized the kids were fine. We ended up standing near each other by the food table and she asked how my work was going. I told her about a new patient I was treating, and she actually listened instead of looking for ways to one-up me with her own accomplishments. She mentioned she'd gotten the job at the smaller firm and was starting next week, and I could see both relief and fear in her eyes about this new chapter as a single working mom. Throughout the afternoon, Holly and I maintained our careful distance, speaking when necessary, but not forcing closeness that neither of us felt ready for. Some relatives tried too hard to get us to interact, while others avoided putting us near each other, and the whole dynamic felt strained compared to the fake harmony we used to have. My mom visibly relaxed as the day went on without incident, though she still tensed up whenever Holly and I ended up in the same conversation. By the time the fireworks started that evening, I realized our family had permanently changed into something more honest, but way less comfortable than before. And maybe that was actually healthier, even if it didn't feel as easy. As I watched Oliver playing with his cousins in my parents' backyard during the fireworks, I thought about everything that had led to this weird new normal we were all navigating. Protecting Oliver from Holly's cruelty was absolutely the right thing to do, but publicly destroying her life at Christmas had created complications I was still processing months later. Holly learned that calling a child a bastard had real consequences that went beyond just hurt feelings, and I learned that revenge feels amazing in the moment, but leaves you dealing with messy aftermath for a long time. Our family would never go back to pretending everything was perfect with Holly's fake achievements and everyone ignoring her mean comments about Oliver. Maybe that was better than the fake peace that had allowed her behavior to continue for years without anyone calling her out on it. Oliver was safe now and knew I would always defend him no matter what, and that mattered more than anything else, even if getting here had been messier and more complicated than I'd planned. He looked up at the fireworks with his cousins beside him and smiled, and in that moment I knew we'd all survive this family mess, even if we'd never be the same as before.